When people move overseas, they often want to know, how am I going to pay my everyday bills in a new country? And so today, beyond offshore banking for the purpose of asset protection and growing your wealth, I'm going to talk about how you can bank to actually make sure you function in your new home so there are no surprises. I was on social media recently and I got into, Lord even knows why, I've got enough problems of my own, into commenting in a forum that I'm in, which is an American Express Platinum Card forum about how someone was moving to Europe. How am I going to pay my bills? I'm going to talk to you about an interaction I had and pick on a number of things that you should know if you're going to be moving to another country, having a home in another country. Maybe you're getting a second citizenship by buying real estate. How do you maintain that property? How do you pay bills somewhere else while leaving your home? And so if it's your first time here, I'm Andrew Henderson, founder of Nomad Capitalist. We help 7- and 8-figure entrepreneurs and investors legally reduce your taxes, protect your assets, increase your freedom, and grow your opportunities internationally. So a woman named Cindy responded to my comments saying, hey, if I were you and I was going to Europe, I would keep my U.S. bank accounts and I would keep my U.S. credit cards. Now, I'm not giving you tax advice. You always want to talk to someone like Nomad Capitalist or a network of tax experts to figure out exactly how this works. But generally speaking, if you're an American, you don't have the same tax nexus issues with bank accounts in the U.S. to where if you're Canadian, Australian, German, what have you, it might behoove you, again, not tax advice, to at least investigate closing down and certainly not using your local bank accounts because you are exiting their tax system while maintaining your citizenship. So Canadians can leave the country, exit the tax system, sign up to pay taxes somewhere else, including in a tax-free jurisdiction, while keeping their citizenship. But you're going to be limited in what so-called residential ties you can have. Americans don't have that problem. Really, anyone doesn't have that problem. You can open a bank account in the United States, and not only is it really not a strike against you, you're not going to be enrolled in the U.S. tax system because you have a U.S. bank account. They'll actually make it easier if you're not an American in that you don't generally have to pay interest, for example, or tax on interest that you earn from U.S. bank accounts. So the U.S. is more friendly in that regard, including in this case to their own citizens, even though Americans are liable to at least file tax returns and claim treaties or exclusions or what have you while living overseas. And so the question was, number one, if I keep my U.S. credit cards, how do I pay them? Cindy said, you can't do that. And I said, well, you can, I've done it. And she said, I basically said, you can pay a U.S. American Express card from overseas. Now it's true, most U.S. credit cards won't allow you to do that. So if you want to pay like your Capital One MasterCard, if you want to pay other cards, they're generally going to say, hey, pay us from a U.S. bank account with ACH. If you have an American Express card, the general procedure has been, we'll accept a wire from a foreign bank account, we're going to charge you a $25 fee to cover our costs, and you'll pay whatever the fee is to initiate that wire on your side. But if for some reason you only have a foreign account but you want to keep using your U.S. credit card because it is harder to get credit cards in other countries, then you can do that. And so that's one reason why American Express has, generally speaking, been easier. To go to another country and get an American Express card or get a credit card, you're going to need to build a credit profile. American Express has talked about how they'll move your credit profile over in some cases, but if you're moving to a country that Nomad Capitalists moved to, they may not have American Express. They may not have kind of any local banks where you want to get into the system, or under certain residence permits, you may not be allowed to do so in exchange for getting tax benefits. So if you can keep a U.S. credit card and your bank will allow you to do so, then I would do that, right? So U.S. banks, like Schwab, for example, they don't like people being expats. I know people sometimes disagree with me on that, but generally speaking, their policy is they don't like you not being in the U.S. and using the account. Other banks just have general high risk factors. Oh, we don't like people who don't live here. I had one online bank account that I hold for many years. They just closed it because I was logging in too much from overseas. They didn't like that, so be it. But if your bank, if you talk to them and say, hey, yeah, we don't care if you're not here. We have no problem with you withdrawing money in different countries. You need an international friendly U.S. bank, and you can keep that generally. You can keep your credit cards, talk to them, make sure they're cool with that, and you can do that. And in the case of American Express, you can even move overseas. So, in my conversation, maybe someone should get Cindy a copy of my resume. Can we get a resume over here for Cindy? Why would you keep a U.S. bank account if you move abroad? I said, and my response was, why not keep as many options as you can? A U.S. bank is highly respected around the world and doesn't impose tax implications. Cindy responded with what everybody responds with when they don't know what to say. They say, LOL. LMAO. By the way, you guys aren't fooling anybody with the LMAO. Like, oh, like we're so wounded that like you didn't know what else to say. You said you're laughing. She responded with the laugh emoji. So my point was, if I'm moving from the U.S. to any other country, Why would I not want to keep a U.S. bank account if my U.S. bank was cool with me doing that? If they would allow me to process transactions out of the country, because then what I can do is, let's say my salary comes into Europe in this case, or let's say I work for myself, I have my own business. One thing you want to understand when you're moving overseas is if you have a business and you're using the foreign earned income exclusion, you're going to pay yourself a salary that's separate from the business. So the earnings aren't just all in one pot. You as the business owner and the worker in the business have a salary, and then you as the business owner, as the shareholder, can figure out what to do with those earnings. If you're U.S., it's going to be a little bit harder to deal with. But you're taking out a salary. Where's that salary going to go? In many cases, sending that salary to a U.S. bank account, in contrast to what many other countries would treat it as, won't be a problem. So if you're moving somewhere else and you can pay yourself a salary to a U.S. bank account, that may be easier either as a transition or even long-term, depending on where you're moving. If I was moving to Mexico, I probably wouldn't really be sending my salary to a Mexican bank account. There's just been historical implications with doing that. I would say if I can, as long as I can ensure that sending my salary to myself in the U.S. for work I'm doing while living in Mexico is not going to add any tax complications, why wouldn't I use my U.S. bank account rather than setting up a bank account in Mexico and theoretically asking a lot more questions, or maybe my salary's been forced to convert into a currency I don't want to hold or whatever else? Why not do that? Why not expand my options? And then if I want to hold a local bank account, I can, and I can move the money between those bank accounts. Now, if I'm being paid into my a salary, again, whether from an employer or from my own business, into a foreign bank account, I can always move part of that salary back to the United States. And so how do you move money between foreign bank accounts? You can use a service like Wise, for example, to connect your U.S. bank account. And if you're living in Europe, you can take dollars out of your bank account in the U.S., convert that into euros with Wise, and then they'll drop the euros into your bank account in Europe. It's really straightforward. You can also do that in reverse. If you've got all your money going into a bank account in Europe, you can take those euros, convert them into dollars, send them into the U.S. for things like paying your credit card bill. If you've got a credit card that requires you to pay it from a U.S. bank, i.e. most non-American Express credit cards. So you want to do an ACH transaction, you either pay yourself the salary to the U.S. bank account, or you simply move the money that you need into the U.S. bank account on a monthly basis to pay any kind of U.S. bills, because a lot of people who are moving are still going to have some kind of bills in the U.S. Maybe you've got a student loan payment, you've got some kind of housing payment, you've got a second home. The U.S. is also going to be more flexible if you're keeping a home available to you than some other countries would be. And so, there may be bills in two different countries if you're making a move. Why not have two different countries' bank accounts? And so, especially, again, if as an American, that's the one benefit you get, is that that bank account doesn't make your taxes harder, then you should do that. You can just move money between them either by just sending a direct wire, right? If you're living in Panama, for example, that's going to be in U.S. dollars as well. So you can just send a wire in U.S. dollars from one bank to the next. If it's in different currencies, you use a service like Wise to move that. And so my point is, why would you close a bank account if you don't have to? If you live in a country like Canada or Australia, where closing your miles earning credit cards, closing your bank accounts is what is needed in your particular case to end your tax exposure in that country, then you should do it. Too many people do hold on to miles just because, they need their miles and they'd rather pay 40% tax and get their miles. But if you can not pay the tax, you can qualify for something like the foreign earned income exclusion in the United States. Why wouldn't you do that? And so Cindy's response was, so you deposit your foreign salary back into a U.S. bank, then do what? Use a U.S. bank to pay your foreign bills and rent? Well, yeah, using a service like Wise, if you got a salary, again, it could be from your own company, from an employer, if you got a salary into a U.S. bank in U.S. dollars and you had a rent to pay overseas, number one, I've done it before in Malaysia, for example. Back when I rented, I would just go to the ATM and I would just take out the money because the landlord wanted to be paid in cash. And so I would pay them the cash and I would get a receipt for that cash. You could also, if you don't have certain people live in countries where they don't have the right residence permit, or they start out by living as a tourist. In certain countries, you can rent an apartment as a tourist, but you can't get a bank account as a tourist. So your salary comes into a U.S. bank account, or in this case, could be any other country's bank account, and you could just transfer it to, example, Malaysia, by converting your dollars into Malaysian ringgit through a service like Wise and sending it directly to the person. They get the exact amount that they need. You pay the exact amount, and so that's how it works. Cindy says, withdraw cash. Yeah, that's what some people want. Some people in places like Spain, for example, like to be paid in cash. Again, it happened to me in Asia. And here's the favorite part. So finally, I've been exposed. You really have never lived or worked abroad. It doesn't work like that. So thank goodness that I'm... now you guys all know the truth. I've really never lived or worked abroad. according to Cindy. My response was, I literally run a company that employs 60 people, and we help millionaires live and work abroad every day, and I've been doing it with my 6 homes for well over a decade now. And Cindy had nothing to say to that, shockingly. But that's how you can do it. I'm not saying don't diversify your bank accounts. In fact, I'm a big believer in diversifying your bank accounts. If you are an American, if you're a U.S. taxpayer, you will need to report those bank accounts in most cases on an FBAR and potentially elsewhere. So you should legally do that reporting. But what I talk about here, offshore banking, is, hey, you have some cash, put that somewhere else. If you have investments, find a bank somewhere else where you can invest that. You've got an IRA in the United States, offshore that potentially, put it into a bank or some kind of investment vehicle where you can do that offshore. But when it comes down to paying household bills, I generally these days do use local bank accounts. And so I have local bank accounts through residence permits where I would have a property. I'll move the money from wherever it comes in. And at times it has come into the United States. At times it comes into Singapore. I will then move out the amount that I need to those bank accounts, let's say for a year in advance. Or if I feel comfortable with the bank, I'll just move a huge chunk. And I'll just kind of slowly, drain it off. So if it's in Malaysia, there's a big chunk of money that sits there. And then, every quarter I just pay bills. And I try and pay bills generally kind of a year in advance, not to deal with it. But you don't necessarily have to do that. Again, does the condo association in Malaysia care if you pay them from a Malaysian bank account or if the money comes through Wise? No, they don't care. Same in Turkey, same in Colombia. I mean, there may be certain restrictions in some of these countries, but guess what? If you've got a home in Colombia and you're not there that often and Colombia is not your main home, you can get a bank account in Colombia, but there may be more restrictions. It may be harder to use. If you can just send the money through Wise once a year in advance, why wouldn't you do that? And so that's how you can use bank accounts in your home country, again, particularly in the United States, where that may be more tax favorable, where you're not going to be penalized for keeping that local account. You don't have to have an account everywhere you live, or you can send your salary, you can send your dividend payments, you can send payments that you have to certain places. And again, in the United States, you can keep your U.S. credit cards, pay them if it's in the case of American Express from a foreign bank account if you're willing to absorb the extra fee, or you can move money between your own accounts using services like Wise and the SWIFT system to have enough money in the U.S. to pay credit cards and then keep your U.S. credit cards, keep your points. So despite the fact that Cindy thinks I've never lived or worked abroad, that's how I move my money legally. It's how you can keep your U.S. bank accounts, and it's how you can make your life easier.